The sound of chainsaws at dawn is not something you expect to hear in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But there I was, standing in my pajamas, watching strangers destroy 7 years of my life's work. They had erected a massive chain-link fence right through the middle of my vegetable garden. My prized tomatoes, the herb spiral I had built with my own hands, the fruit trees I had nursed from saplings. All of it was now trapped behind industrial fencing. The construction foreman barely looked up when I ran outside screaming. He just pointed to a clipboard and said the HOA had ordered it. Half of my garden was now officially theirs. I stood there in shock, watching years of careful cultivation being treated like worthless weeds. The fence posts were already cemented in place. There was no going back. That morning, I thought my life was over. I had no idea that this violation would lead me to discover something that would turn their roof into my bee empire, while the state paid me thousands in tax credits for the privilege. My morning routine had been the same for 7 years. Coffee first, then a walk through my garden to check on the plants before heading to work. The vegetable garden stretched along the eastern edge of my property, positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun. I had spent countless weekends building raised beds, installing drip irrigation, and creating a small ecosystem that produced enough food to feed my family year-round. The garden was not just about vegetables. It was my sanctuary. After stressful days at the office, I would come home and lose myself in the quiet work of tending plants. The herb spiral I had constructed from field stones was particularly special to me. Basil, oregano, thyme, and rosemary grew in perfect harmony, each finding its ideal microclimate within the design. But that Tuesday morning in March, everything changed. The sound of diesel engines and metal clanging jolted me awake at 6 in the morning. I stumbled to the kitchen window and felt my heart stop. 3 workers in hard hats were unrolling chain-link fencing directly through the center of my garden. A small excavator was already digging post holes, crushing my carefully tended soil beneath its tracks. I rushed outside without even grabbing a robe. The cold morning air hit my bare arms, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on the destruction happening before my eyes. The fence line cut right through my tomato beds, separating my herb spiral from the rest of the garden. Heavy boots and machinery were scattering years of compost and soil amendments. "Stop! What are you doing?" I shouted at the nearest worker. He looked up from his measuring tape and shrugged. "Following orders, ma'am. HOA says this is the new property line." He handed me a work order stamped with the Willowbrook Homeowners Association logo. The document was brief and official, stating that fence installation was required for property line clarification and community aesthetic standards. I stared at the paper in disbelief. Property line clarification. This was my land. I had the deed, the survey, and the closing documents. Every plant in this garden had been positioned according to the official property boundaries established when I bought the house. The fence they were installing cut at least 15 feet into what I knew was my property. "There has to be some mistake," I said, my voice shaking. "This is my garden. I have been growing here for 7 years. The foreman wiped his hands on a dirty rag and looked at me with practiced indifference. "Take it up with the HOA, lady. We just put the fence where they told us to put it." By noon, the damage was complete. A 6-foot chain-link fence now bisected my property, with half of my garden trapped on the other side. The gate they installed was padlocked, and the sign posted on it was clear: HOA property, no trespassing. I could see my tomato seedlings wilting in their beds, inaccessible behind the barrier that had appeared overnight. That afternoon, I called the HOA office 5 times. Each time, I was transferred to voicemail or told that the person I was looking for was unavailable. When I finally reached someone who claimed to have authority, Her response was dismissive and rehearsed. The fence installation was approved by the board for community improvement. If you have concerns about property boundaries, you are welcome to file a formal complaint. I walked through what remained of my garden that evening, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had been taken from me. The fence had not just divided my land, it had severed connections that took years to establish. My compost bins were now separated from the beds they were meant to nourish. The rainwater collection system I had carefully designed was split in half, rendering it useless. Standing there in the fading light, looking at the industrial barrier that now dominated my backyard, I realized this was about more than property lines. This was a deliberate act of power, designed to show me exactly how little control I had over my own life. The HOA had sent a message, and they expected me to accept it quietly. They had no idea how wrong they were about that. I spent the next 3 days buried in paperwork. Every document related to my property purchase was spread across my dining room table. The original survey, the deed, the title insurance, the closing statement, everything that proved where my property began and ended. The more I studied the documents, the angrier I became. The fence was not even close to the actual property line. According to the official survey conducted when I bought the house, the HOA had encroached nearly 20 feet onto my land. This was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately chosen to ignore the legal boundaries and take what belonged to me. I photographed everything: the fence posts, the destroyed garden beds, and the measurements from my house to the new barrier. I created a detailed map showing the discrepancy between the survey and the fence placement. Armed with this evidence, I prepared my first formal complaint to the HOA board. The response came back within a week, and it was exactly what I expected: a bureaucratic brush-off designed to discourage further action. The letter, signed by HOA President Margaret Thornfield, claimed that the fence had been installed for aesthetic improvements and community standards compliance. It stated that my vegetable garden violated several covenants regarding agricultural use in residential areas and maintenance of unsightly plant materials. I read the letter 3 times, each reading making me more furious than the last. Unsightly plant materials. My garden was featured in the neighborhood newsletter just 2 years ago as an example of sustainable landscaping. The tomatoes and peppers I grew were not agricultural violations. They were part of the diverse ecosystem that made our community beautiful. But the letter also revealed something important. The HOA was not claiming they had the right to take my land. Instead, they were trying to justify their actions by attacking my use of that land. This suggested they knew the fence placement was legally questionable, and they were hoping I would be too intimidated to fight back. I decided to consult with a property attorney. Sarah Martinez had handled my home purchase years earlier, and I trusted her to give me straight answers about my options. When I spread my documentation across her conference table, her reaction was immediate and unambiguous. "They do not have a leg to stand on," she said, studying the survey with a magnifying glass. "This fence is clearly on your property, and their justification is nonsense. Vegetable gardens are not agricultural use in the legal sense, and they cannot retroactively change property boundaries without your consent." Sarah explained that I had several legal options, ranging from formal mediation to a civil lawsuit for trespass and property damage. She estimated that forcing the HOA to remove the fence and pay damages would cost between $5,000 and $15,000 in legal fees, assuming they did not drag the case out with frivolous motions and appeals. "The problem," she continued, "is that HOA boards like this one often have deep pockets and plenty of time to fight. They know most homeowners cannot afford prolonged legal battles, so they count on people giving up rather than pursuing justice. As if to prove her point, I received another letter from the HOA the very next day. This one threatened me with daily fines for failure to maintain property in compliance with community standards. The portion of my garden that remained on my side of the fence was now considered a violation because it did not match the approved landscaping guidelines. I was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. The HOA had stolen my land, destroyed my garden, and was now threatening to fine me for the remnants of what they had not taken. Every letter I sent was met with form responses that ignored my evidence and repeated the same legal-sounding phrases about community standards and board authority. 3 weeks into this battle, I was exhausted and discouraged. The legal fees were mounting, and the HOA showed no signs of backing down. I began to understand why so many homeowners simply gave up when faced with this kind of institutional bullying. The system was designed to wear people down until they accepted whatever scraps of justice they were offered. But late one night, while researching HOA law and property rights, I stumbled across something that changed everything. I was reading about agricultural exemptions and right-to-farm laws when I found a reference to urban beekeeping regulations. The article mentioned that many states offered substantial tax credits and legal protections for residents who established pollinator habitats, even in suburban areas. I leaned back in my chair and looked out my kitchen window at the fence that had destroyed my garden. For the first time in weeks, I was not thinking about what I had lost. Instead, I was thinking about what I might be able to gain. The HOA had taught me an important lesson about power and leverage. It was time to return the favor. I was not the only victim of HOA overreach in Willowbrook. That became clear when I started talking to my neighbors about what had happened to my garden. What I discovered was a pattern of harassment and intimidation that had been going on for years, with Margaret Thornfield and her board treating homeowners like subjects rather than members. My next-door neighbor, Tom Bradley, had been fighting the HOA for 8 months over his front yard landscaping. The board had decided that his native wildflower garden was unkempt and ordered him to replace it with approved turf grass. When he refused, they began issuing daily fines that had already reached $3,000. I planted those wildflowers to help the local ecosystem, Tom explained as we stood looking at his beautiful meadow-like yard. Butterflies, bees, birds, they all depend on native plants, but Margaret thinks everything should look like a golf course. Across the street, the Johnson family was dealing with their own HOA nightmare. They had installed solar panels on their roof to reduce their energy costs, only to receive a violation notice claiming the panels were unsightly modifications that required board approval. The approval process, they were told, could take up to 6 months and required a $500 application fee. "We are trying to do the right thing for the environment," said Janet Johnson. "But the HOA acts like we committed some kind of crime. They want us to pay hundreds of dollars for the privilege of saving money on our electric bill." The more neighbors I talked to, the clearer the pattern became. Margaret Thornfield and her board were not interested in maintaining community standards. They were interested in maintaining control. Any homeowner who dared to make decisions without their permission became a target for harassment and fines. I organized an informal meeting at my house the following Saturday. 12 families showed up, each with their own story of HOA abuse. We spread our documentation across my living room: violation notices, fine assessments, legal letters, and photographs of the alleged infractions that had triggered board action. What we discovered was shocking. The HOA was operating with complete disregard for its governing documents. Fines were being assessed without proper notice. Board meetings were being held without required member notification. Financial decisions were being made behind closed doors, with no transparency about how our dues were being spent. "This is not how homeowner associations are supposed to work," said retired attorney Frank Morrison, who lived 3 streets over. "What we have here is a small group of people who think they can run this community like their personal kingdom." Frank offered to help us prepare for the next board meeting, which was scheduled for the following Thursday. We decided to attend as a group and present our concerns publicly. Each family would have 3 minutes to speak, and we would document everything for potential legal action. The board meeting was held in the community center, a space that our dues pay to maintain. When our group of 12 families walked in together, the reaction from Margaret Thornfield and her 3 board members was immediate and hostile. They had expected to conduct their usual rubber stamp session without any interference from actual homeowners. Margaret was a woman in her 60s with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested she had never been told no in her entire life. She wore a navy blue blazer with gold buttons and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This meeting is for official board business," she announced before anyone could speak. "If residents have complaints, they need to follow proper procedures and submit written requests for consideration." Frank Morrison stood up slowly, his decades of legal experience evident in his calm demeanor. "Mrs. Thornfield, according to your bylaws, homeowners have the right to address the board during the public comment period. We are not here to complain. We are here to hold this board accountable for violations of the governing documents." What followed was the most tense 30 minutes I had ever experienced in a community setting. One by one, homeowners presented evidence of board misconduct: the illegal fence on my property, the arbitrary fines were imposed without due process, the secret meetings and financial irregularities that violated state HOA regulations. Margaret and her board responded with hostility and defensiveness. They tried to cut off speakers, claimed that all their actions were within their authority, and threatened additional fines for anyone who continued to disrupt board operations. But something important happened in that room. For the first time, the victims of HOA abuse were no longer isolated. We had found each other, and we had found our voice. Margaret Thornfield was no longer dealing with individual homeowners who could be intimidated into silence. She was facing an organized community that had done its homework and was prepared to fight back. As we left the meeting that night, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The HOA had declared war on its members, and we were finally ready to fight back with the same tactics they had been using against us. But I also knew that confronting them directly was not enough. They had lawyers, unlimited access to our dues money, and years of experience in bureaucratic warfare. If I wanted to win this fight, I needed to find a different battlefield, one where they could not control the rules of engagement. That night, I went back to researching urban beekeeping regulations. What I found would change everything. My legal research had taken on an obsessive quality. Every evening after work, I would spread documents across my kitchen table and dive deeper into property law, HOA regulations, and agricultural exemptions. I was looking for any angle that might give me leverage against Margaret Thornfield and her board. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday night in April. I was reading about right-to-farm laws when I found a reference to urban agriculture programs. These state-level initiatives were designed to encourage sustainable food production and environmental conservation in residential areas. The tax benefits and legal protections were substantial, but what caught my attention was a specific section about pollinator habitat creation. According to the state environmental agency, residents who established bee colonies or native pollinator gardens could qualify for significant tax credits. The program was part of an emergency initiative to address declining bee populations and their impact on agricultural systems. Even more interesting, these agricultural activities were protected under state law and could not be restricted by local ordinances or homeowner association rules. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the computer screen. Beekeeping was a protected agricultural activity. It qualified for state tax credits, and it could not be stopped by HOA regulations. This was exactly the weapon I had been looking for. But where could I place bee colonies that would have the maximum impact on Margaret Thornfield and her board? The answer came to me in a moment of pure inspiration. I pulled up the satellite view of our neighborhood on Google Maps and studied the layout of houses and property lines. Margaret Thornfield's house sat on a corner lot with a large, south-facing roof that received direct sunlight all day long. The positioning was perfect for commercial-scale beekeeping operations. Even better, the roof was visible from the street and several neighboring properties. Anyone living in that house would be constantly reminded of the bee colonies buzzing overhead. I spent the next 2 hours researching commercial beekeeping operations and state licensing requirements. What I learned was fascinating. A single rooftop could support multiple bee colonies, each containing up to 60,000 bees during peak season. The colonies would be active from early spring through late fall, creating a constant hum of activity that would be audible both inside and outside the house. The legal protections were ironclad. Under state agricultural law, properly licensed beekeeping operations could not be restricted by municipal zoning ordinances or private covenants. As long as I followed proper safety protocols and maintained required licensing, the HOA would have no legal authority to interfere with my agricultural activities. But the most beautiful aspect of the plan was the financial incentive structure. The state offered a tax credit of $500 per established colony, plus additional credits for environmental education programs and native plant cultivation. A rooftop operation with 8 to 10 colonies could generate several $1,000s annually in tax benefits. I was not just planning revenge. I was planning to get paid by the state for the privilege of making Margaret Thornfield's life miserable. The next morning, I called the State Department of Agriculture and spoke with a specialist about urban beekeeping programs. Jennifer Walsh had been administering the Pollinator Habitat Initiative for 3 years, and her enthusiasm for the program was immediately apparent. "We are desperate to get more bee colonies established in suburban areas," she explained. "The suburban environment can be ideal for bees because of the diversity of flowering plants and the absence of agricultural pesticides. A well-managed rooftop operation can be incredibly productive." Jennifer walked me through the licensing process, which was surprisingly straightforward. I would need to complete a basic beekeeping course, pass a written exam, and submit site plans showing the proposed location of colonies. The state would provide initial funding for equipment and bee purchases, plus ongoing technical support from extension agents. "The rooftop location you are describing sounds perfect," she continued. "South-facing exposure, protection from strong winds, easy access for maintenance. You could probably support 8 to 12 colonies on a roof that size." I scheduled my beekeeping course for the following weekend and began preparing the paperwork for my license application. But I also needed a commercial partner who could help with the actual bee management. Running a multi-colony operation was not something I could handle alone, especially while working a full-time job. I found exactly what I needed at Hillside Honey, a commercial beekeeping operation about 30 miles outside town. Owner Mike Patterson had been expanding into urban locations and was immediately interested in a suburban rooftop partnership. Suburban locations can be gold mines for honey production, Mike explained when I visited his facility. Lots of flowering trees, garden plants, and minimal pesticide use. The only challenge is usually getting permission from property owners and dealing with neighbor complaints. I smiled as I thought about Margaret Thornfield trying to complain about state-licensed agricultural activity on her roof. I do not think neighbor complaints will be a problem in this case. Mike and I worked out a partnership agreement where his company would manage the day-to-day colony maintenance in exchange for a percentage of honey production and state credit payments. I would maintain ownership of the colonies and receive the bulk of the financial benefits, while he provided the expertise needed to keep the operation running smoothly. By the end of May, all the pieces were in place. My beekeeping license was approved. The partnership with Hillside Honey was finalized. The state had approved my application for 8 starter colonies and provided a grant covering initial equipment costs. All that remained was choosing the perfect moment to begin installation. I wanted Margaret Thornfield to be home when the first colonies arrived. I wanted her to watch from her kitchen window as thousands of bees took up residence above her head. I wanted her to understand exactly what it felt like to have someone else make decisions about her property without asking for permission first. The installation had to be perfect. I was not just placing bee colonies. I was executing a strategic operation that would be legally bulletproof and practically devastating. Every detail needed to be planned, from the timing of delivery to the documentation of permits and licenses. Mike Patterson and I spent weeks preparing for what we privately called Operation Rooftop. We mapped out the optimal placement of 8 bee colonies across Margaret Thornfield's south-facing roof, spacing them for maximum productivity while ensuring they would be visible from multiple angles. Each colony would house between 40 and 60,000 bees at peak capacity, creating an aerial workforce of nearly 500,000 insects. The legal documentation was extensive and deliberately comprehensive. I had my state beekeeping license, commercial partnership agreement, environmental impact assessment, and agricultural tax exemption certificates. I also obtained letters of support from the University Extension Office and the local environmental conservation group. If Margaret or the HOA board wanted to challenge my operation, they would have to take on multiple state agencies and agricultural advocacy organizations. The timing was crucial. I wanted the installation to happen on a weekday morning when Margaret would be home to witness it personally. Based on 3 weeks of casual observation, I knew she typically had coffee on her back deck between 7 and 8 a.m., which would give her a perfect view of the roof installation process. We scheduled the operation for a Tuesday in early June. Mike would arrive at 6 a.m. with his team and equipment truck. The actual installation would take about 2 hours, with each colony being carefully positioned and secured to the roof structure. By the time Margaret realized what was happening, the bees would already be settling into their new home above her head. I also contacted Channel 7 News about the story. Environmental reporter Lisa Chen had been covering urban agriculture initiatives, and she was immediately interested in what might be the largest residential beekeeping installation in the county. She agreed to arrive at 8 a.m. to document the project and interview me about the environmental benefits. The night before installation, I could barely sleep. I kept running through every aspect of the plan, checking for potential problems or legal challenges. But every scenario I considered led to the same conclusion. The HOA had no legal authority to stop protected agricultural activity, especially when it was generating tax revenue for the state and providing documented environmental benefits. At 5:30 a.m., I was already dressed and watching from my kitchen window. Mike's truck arrived exactly on schedule, followed by a smaller vehicle carrying his installation team. They worked with quiet efficiency, unloading wooden hive boxes, metal stands, and protective equipment. By 6:15, the first colony was being carried up onto Margaret's roof. The wooden boxes looked deceptively peaceful, but I knew each one contained thousands of bees ready to begin their new life in suburban paradise. The installation team wore full protective suits and moved with the careful precision of people who understood they were handling living weapons. At exactly 7 a.m., Margaret Thornfield opened her back door and stepped onto her deck with a steaming coffee mug. She was wearing a pink bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, clearly expecting a quiet morning routine. Instead, she found herself staring up at four men in white suits installing industrial beehives on her roof. Her scream was audible 3 houses away. I watched from my window as Margaret rushed back inside, presumably to call someone in authority who could stop this invasion of her perfect suburban world. Within minutes, she was back outside, this time fully dressed and holding a cell phone to her ear. Her gestures were animated and angry as she pointed at the roof and demanded immediate action from whoever was on the other end of the call. The installation team continued their work without interruption. By 7:30, 6 colonies were in place, and the bees were already beginning to explore their new territory. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, a low humming that would become the soundtrack of Margaret's daily life for the next 6 months. At 8 a.m., Lisa Chen arrived with her camera crew, followed almost immediately by 2 police cars responding to Margaret's frantic calls for help. What followed was one of the most satisfying conversations I had ever witnessed. Margaret rushed up to the first police officer, demanding that he immediately arrest everyone involved in what she called property destruction and public endangerment. The officer, Sergeant Rodriguez, listened patiently before asking to see my permits and documentation. I handed him the complete file I had prepared, including my beekeeping license, agricultural exemption certificates, and state environmental agency approvals. He studied the documents carefully while Margaret continued her increasingly shrill demands for immediate action. "Ma'am," Sergeant Rodriguez finally said, "this appears to be a properly licensed agricultural operation with full state approval. I do not see any violations of law or public safety regulations." Margaret's face turned red. "Agricultural operation. There are millions of dangerous bees on my roof. This cannot be legal." The sergeant looked up at the peaceful installation team securing the final colonies. "According to these documents, this is exactly the kind of environmental conservation project the state is trying to encourage. Unless you can show me a specific law being violated, there is nothing I can do." Lisa Chen stepped forward with her microphone. "Mrs. Thornfield, how do you respond to claims that your HOA has been harassing residents who try to implement environmentally sustainable projects?" Margaret stared at the camera in shock, clearly realizing that her private neighborhood dispute had just become a public relations nightmare. The police officers returned to their cars. The installation team finished their work and departed. The news crew got their story about innovative urban agriculture. And Margaret Thornfield was left standing in her backyard, looking up at 500,000 bees that had just moved in permanently above her head. The best part was that this was only the beginning. Bee colonies are most active during the warmest months of the year, which means Margaret would be dealing with maximum buzzing activity all summer long. Every time she tried to enjoy her back deck, every time she opened her windows for fresh air, every time she had guests over for outdoor entertaining, she would be reminded of the consequences of stealing other people's property. But I was not done yet. The state credits and environmental benefits were just starting to flow, and I had plans for expanding the operation that would make her current situation seem peaceful by comparison. Margaret Thornfield's discovery of the bee colonies was just the beginning of what would become the most dramatic month in Willowbrook HOA history. Within hours of the installation, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from board members, HOA lawyers, and local news outlets wanting to know more about the suburban beekeeping operation that had appeared overnight. The first official response came in the form of an emergency board meeting notice, hand-delivered to my door by a clearly flustered Margaret herself. She looked like she had not slept in days, and I could understand why. The constant humming from her roof had to be audible inside her house, especially in the upstairs bedrooms directly below the colonies. "This is completely unacceptable," she said, waving the meeting notice at me. "Those dangerous insects are a public health hazard, and they are going to be removed immediately." I smiled and handed her a copy of my agricultural license and state environmental protection documents. "Margaret, those are legally protected pollinators contributing to ecosystem restoration. The state is paying me tax credits to maintain them." Her face went through several shades of red as she scanned the official documents. "I do not care what the state says. This is a residential neighborhood with HOA covenants that prohibit agricultural use." "You might want to check state law on that," I replied calmly. "Agricultural activities with environmental protection status supersede local ordinances and private covenants. Your HOA has no authority over state-licensed conservation projects." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I arrived prepared for battle. I brought Mike Patterson from Hillside Honey, Frank Morrison, our retired attorney neighbor, and Jennifer Walsh from the State Agriculture Department. We also had Lisa Chen from Channel 7 News, who was continuing her coverage of what had become a statewide story about suburban environmental innovation. The community center was packed. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about the bee installation and the upcoming confrontation with the HOA board. Many residents who had never attended a board meeting were there to see how this drama would unfold. Margaret called the meeting to order with barely controlled fury. "We are here to address the illegal installation of dangerous insects on community property," she began. "This board will not tolerate residents who think they can ignore HOA authority and endanger public safety." Frank Morrison stood up immediately. "Point of order, Mrs. Thornfield. The bee colonies are not on community property. They are on private residential property, installed with full state licensing and environmental agency approval." Margaret slammed her gavel on the table. "That roof belongs to the HOA under our architectural control covenants. No modifications can be made without board approval." This was the moment I had been waiting for. I stood up and addressed the room full of neighbors and news cameras. "Margaret, let me ask you a question. When exactly did my roof become HOA property?" The room went silent. Margaret's face showed confusion mixed with anger. "What are you talking about? The colonies are on my roof." I smiled and pulled out a document that had taken me weeks to prepare. "Actually, According to the property survey I commissioned last month, your roof extends 14 feet onto my land, just like the fence you illegally installed through my garden. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Neighbors began talking among themselves. Lisa Chen moved closer with her camera. Margaret stared at me with the expression of someone who had just realized they had walked into a trap. "That is impossible," she sputtered. "This is my house. I have lived here for 12 years." "And I have lived in my house for 7 years," I replied. "But unlike you, I respect property boundaries." I handed copies of the survey to Frank Morrison and Jennifer Walsh. According to this official survey, the bee colonies are installed entirely on my property. The section of roof they occupy belongs to me under the legal property description. Frank studied the survey and nodded approvingly. This appears to be correct. The property line extends 14 feet beyond the house foundation, which would include the roof overhang and a portion of the main roof structure. Margaret was now visibly shaking. "This cannot be legal. You cannot put bees on someone else's house." Jennifer Walsh from the State Agriculture Department spoke for the first time. "Ours, Thornfield, agricultural installations on property owners' land are fully protected under state law, regardless of where buildings or other structures happen to be located. Property boundaries are determined by legal survey, not by assumption." The meeting devolved into chaos as the implications became clear to everyone in the room. Margaret had spent months harassing homeowners about property compliance, while her own house was illegally built on someone else's land. The fence that had destroyed my garden was not just trespassing. It was part of a pattern of property violations that extended back years. But the most beautiful part of the revelation was yet to come. I stood up again and addressed the room. "I want everyone to understand that I am not trying to take anyone's house or destroy the neighborhood. The bee colonies will continue operating as a state-licensed environmental conservation project. The honey production and tax credits will benefit our entire community." I paused and looked directly at Margaret. "However, I do expect the illegal fence to be removed from my garden, and I expect compensation for the damage caused by 7 months of trespassing and property destruction." The room erupted in applause. Neighbors who had been victims of HOA harassment were finally seeing justice served. Margaret and her board were exposed as hypocrites who violated the same property rights they claimed to protect. Lisa Chen got her interviews. The story went viral on social media, and by the following week, legal pressure was mounting from multiple directions. The State Attorney General's office began investigating HOA compliance violations. Property owners throughout the neighborhood were commissioning surveys to verify their actual boundary lines. Most importantly, the constant humming from Margaret's roof had become a daily reminder that actions have consequences. Every morning when she stepped onto her deck for coffee, every evening when she tried to enjoy her backyard, every night when she tried to sleep in her upstairs bedroom, she was surrounded by the sound of 500,000 bees that would not be going anywhere anytime soon. The HOA had taught me a valuable lesson about power and intimidation. Now I was returning the favor, with compound interest and state tax credits. 6 months later, I was standing in my restored garden, watching Mike Patterson and his team conduct the first honey harvest from our rooftop colonies. The illegal fence was gone, removed at HOA expense after their lawyers advised them that fighting a property survey would be financial suicide. My vegetable beds were thriving again, enhanced by the intensive pollination from 40,000 bees living directly overhead. The transformation had been remarkable in every way. The bee colonies had produced over 200 pounds of honey in their first season, along with beeswax, propolis, and other valuable products. The state tax credits had more than covered my initial investment, and the ongoing environmental grants were funding expansion into native plant cultivation and pollinator education programs. But the financial benefits were only part of the story. The real victory was measured in the changes that had swept through Willowbrook since the day those first colonies were installed on Margaret Thornfield's roof. Margaret herself had lasted exactly 3 months before putting her house on the market. The constant humming, the steady stream of visitors wanting to see the famous bee installation, and the daily reminder of her defeat had proven too much to endure. She moved to a senior community in Florida, where HOA covenants presumably did not conflict with state agricultural law. The entire HOA board had been voted out in a special election held just 2 months after the bee installation. Homeowners who had suffered years of harassment and arbitrary fines finally had enough evidence of board misconduct to demand change. The new board, led by Frank Morrison, had immediately begun revering punitive policies and focusing on actual community improvement rather than petty control. Tom Bradley's wildflower garden was not only approved but celebrated as a model of environmental stewardship. The Johnson family's solar panels were grandfathered in, and new guidelines actively encouraged renewable energy installations. Throughout the neighborhood, residents were implementing sustainable landscaping and conservation projects without fear of retaliation. The bee operation had become a source of community pride rather than controversy. Local schools brought students to learn about pollinator conservation. The University Extension Office used our installation as a demonstration site for urban agriculture programs. Environmental groups from across the state visited to study our model for suburban beekeeping integration. The honey harvest celebration had grown into an annual neighborhood festival. Families gathered in the community center to taste fresh honey, learn about bee biology, and celebrate the environmental success story that had transformed our community. Children who had initially been afraid of the buzzing sounds now eagerly participated in educational programs about pollinator conservation. The financial impact had exceeded every projection. The state credits, honey sales, and agricultural grants had generated over $15,000 in the first year alone. I had reinvested most of the profits into expanding the operation, adding 4 more colonies, and establishing a native plant nursery that supplied pollinator-friendly landscaping throughout the region. Mike Patterson and I had developed our partnership into a full-scale urban agriculture consulting business. We were helping communities across 3 counties establish their rooftop beekeeping operations, always with proper permits and always with full respect for property boundaries. The waiting list for our services had grown to over 6 months. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was personal. My garden had returned to its former glory, enhanced by the intensive pollination that increased vegetable yields by over 40%. The herb spiral that had been destroyed by the fence was now more productive than ever, with basil and oregano plants that seemed to thrive under the constant attention of my aerial workforce. I had also discovered an unexpected passion for beekeeping itself. What began as a strategic revenge plot had evolved into genuine fascination with bee behavior, colony management, and the complex ecosystem relationships that supported both agricultural productivity and environmental health. I was planning to expand my operation to include queen breeding and colony sales to other urban beekeepers. The legal ramifications had continued long after Margaret's departure. The property survey that revealed her roof encroachment had triggered a neighborhood-wide investigation of boundary violations. Several other properties had similar issues, all traced back to sloppy surveying and aggressive HOA policies that ignored actual property lines in favor of aesthetic preferences. A class action lawsuit against the former HOA board had resulted in substantial settlements for affected homeowners. The legal precedent established in our case has been cited in similar disputes across the state, strengthening property rights protections against HOA overreach. Standing in my garden that autumn evening, listening to the gentle hum of bees returning to their rooftop home after a day of pollination work, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 7 months earlier, I had been a victim of institutional bullying, watching helplessly as my life's work was destroyed by people who confused authority with power. The transformation had required patience, research, and strategic thinking. Most importantly, it had required understanding that the best revenge is not destruction, but creation. Instead of simply fighting the HOA's abuse of power, I had built something positive that benefited the entire community while making their harassment impossible to continue. The bees had taught me that complex problems often have elegant solutions. A single colony works together with perfect coordination, each individual contributing to the collective success of the whole. By aligning my personal goals with broader environmental and community benefits, I had created a win-win scenario that even my opponents could not effectively attack. As I walked back toward my house, I could see the soft glow of lights in the windows where Margaret Thornfield once lived. The new owners, a young couple with 2 small children, had embraced the bee operation and were planning to install their pollinator garden in the spring. They understood that the humming sounds represented life, productivity, and environmental stewardship rather than something to be feared. The illegal fence was gone, but its memory served as a permanent reminder of what happens when people mistake temporary authority for permanent power. The HOA had taught me that property rights mean nothing without the knowledge and determination to defend them. In return, I had taught them that revenge is a dish best served with honey, state tax credits, and the buzzing soundtrack of justice being done. My garden was restored, my community was stronger, and my bank account was healthier thanks to the state's enthusiasm for urban agriculture. Most importantly, I had discovered that the best way to defeat bullies is not to become one yourself, but to build something so positive and beneficial that their negativity becomes irrelevant. The bees would continue their work through the next growing season and beyond, a living testament to the power of strategic thinking and environmental stewardship. And every morning, as I walked through my thriving garden listening to the sounds of 500,000 pollinators beginning their daily work, I would remember that sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones that make the world a little bit better for everyone.